I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco, and this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, we will talk to Microsoft co-founder Bill Gates about his new book, How to Avoid Climate Disaster, how tech can solve the biggest problem the world has ever faced, plus his thoughts on the Bitcoin, quote, mania and the grim toll that COVID has taken around the world and here at home. Plus, Tuesday marks the House hearing on the SolarWinds hack. Expected to testify on Capitol Hill, top execs from SolarWinds, FireEye, and Microsoft will have the latest. And a bumpy Monday for Bitcoin. The cryptocurrency falls below $50,000 for the first time after Elon Musk says prices, quote, seem high. Those stories in a moment, but first, the tech sector dragging the Nasdaq to a 3-week low. Our Kriti Gupta has more. Kriti, walk us through the day.
Well, Emily, it looked like a risk-off session when you first looked at it, but look under the hood and you'll really see it's those tech major averages that are weighing on the S&P 500. So your Microsofts, your Apples, your Teslas. Looking at the chart in front of you or the index in front of you right now, the Nasdaq 100 really taking it on the chin by the most in 3 weeks. And like I mentioned, those heavyweights weighing on the S&P 500, all of those grouped together in the New York FANG index. You can really see the pain there. Flip up the boards, and I do want to take a look at the semiconductor index, taking a look at a 20-day chart, and you'll really see that you've started to pare back some of those gains that you saw earlier this month, of course, on that chip shortage, then the Biden administration helping out. Now really just getting a little bit of a reality check. Flip up the boards one more time, and you can look at some of the individual stock stories. The one right on top, those massive gains, as much as 19% for Churchill Capital, a SPAC that was reported to near a deal to go public with Lucid Motors as soon as this week. That scoop, one of our reporters was Ed Ludlow, our very own Ed Ludlow. And then, of course, like I mentioned, Tesla really taking a hit. Elon Musk actually tweeting the prices of Bitcoin and Ether do seem a little bit high. Remember that we had $1.5 billion of a Tesla investment in Bitcoin. So that tweet itself taking a hit to Tesla stock. And before I show you what it did to Bitcoin, a quick nod to those stay-at-home stocks, Zoom and Peloton taking a little bit of a hit as well. Flip up the boards and let's go to that Bitcoin chart. Look at what it's doing. I mean, coming off of that record high of 59,000 after Elon Musk tweeted that tweet that the prices seem a little too high, now hovering around 54,000, really shows you the power of what one man's tweet can do, Emily.
All right, Bloomberg's Kriti Gupta, thanks so much for walking us through that. I want to stick with Bitcoin, again, falling as much as 17% today, briefly back below that $50,000 mark. The world's richest person, Elon Musk, tweeting his concern that the world's largest cryptocurrency had risen too far, too fast. For more, we're joined by Bloomberg's Katie Greifeld. So, Katie, is Elon's tweet the only reason we saw this slide today, or was there something else going on here?
Well, it's hard to ever really know with Bitcoin. It's just such a volatile asset. But it is thought that Elon Musk sort of throwing cold water on the rally was a factor on why we got this dramatic drop today. So as we all know, Elon Musk tweeted Saturday that prices of Bitcoin and Ether seemed high. Bitcoin proceeded to hit another record on Sunday, just below $59,000 a coin before dropping today. And the thought there is, while Bitcoin trading on the weekend is primarily individuals and day traders, institutional traders, sort of a new entrant to the Bitcoin market, they tend to follow traditional market hours. So Monday morning would be the first chance that they'd have to really react to Musk's tweet. So that could explain the delayed reaction. Another theory, though, is that we also heard from Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen today, and she said that Bitcoin is an extremely inefficient way of conducting transactions. So that could also be denting appetite today, in addition to Musk's tweet.
So, Katie, what does Bitcoin falling actually mean for Tesla? Because Tesla has been on track to make more from its Bitcoin investment than profits on electric cars in all of 2020.
That's exactly the interesting part of the story here. You know, Musk's tweets are always a little bit bizarre, but this one especially so, since Tesla now has a business reason for wanting Bitcoin to continue to move higher. They made waves earlier this month after announcing that they had purchased $1.5 billion of Bitcoin, following the likes of MicroStrategy, for example. And that endorsement alone from Tesla was a big reason why Bitcoin is still up over 58% in February, even with today's drop. So given that the company now has Bitcoin on its balance sheet, you would think it's in Tesla's interest that the crypto would continue to rally. But again, we are talking about Elon Musk here. He has done things like this before. He tweeted even in May that Tesla shares, for example, were too high. So it's not completely out of the ordinary for Musk to tweet something like this.
All right, Bloomberg's Katie Greifeld, the story is not over. I am going to ask Bill Gates about this a bit later in the show. But first, part one of that interview with Microsoft co-founder Bill Gates, how tech can solve the biggest problem the world has ever faced. We're talking about climate change and his new book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. That's next. This is Bloomberg. Microsoft co-founder Bill Gates is a self-described optimist, and probably nowhere more is optimism needed than in confronting the grim realities of climate change. His new book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, the Solutions We Have and the Breakthroughs We Need, offers practical advice and describes how technology can be deployed to fight an urgent need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I sat down with Gates earlier today, both the optimist and the realist, and asked him how likely it is we'll get to zero emissions and how much worse than the pandemic climate change could be.
So the deaths will just go up over time as you get more heat waves, forest fires, and most importantly, the inability to go outdoors and do farming anywhere near the equator. And so it'll get worse and worse. The temperature rise is based on the total cumulative amount of CO2 we put in the atmosphere. And so certainly by the end of the century, you'll have permanent die-offs of all these coral ecosystems. No beach you ever went to will be around. And sadly, there won't be a simple solution like, hey, let's get a vaccine and we can get ourselves out of this thing, because it's the entire industrial economy that's responsible for these emissions.
Now, you say we have no choice but to get to zero from 51 billion tons a year. And I know you're optimistic. You say it'll be hard, but I want to hear from Bill Gates, the realist. Like, how likely is it that we get to zero? Is there a percentage you can give me?
Well, unless the younger generation adopts this as the moral cause that's important to them beyond their individual success, and they're very loud about that in all the rich countries and across multiple political parties, unless we have that's always putting it first on the agenda, then I don't think we'll meet 2050. But I do see signs that that's, coming into place. I mean, what cause could be more important than preserving livability of the earth and these natural ecosystems? So my role was simply to say, yes, this goal is a good one, although very, very hard, and then talk about how we accelerate the innovation and make people realize that because we're trying to get to zero, it's every sector of emission. And there's been a tendency to focus on two of the five, electricity and transport, but kind of ignore agriculture and buildings and then manufacturing, including cement and steel. So it's hopefully a dose of realism for anyone who thought it was easy, but also a roadmap to help people who think it's impossible to see that it is possible.
Now, you mentioned 2050 there. We hear a lot of dates. John Kerry said we have 9 years left. The UN said we have 10 years left back in 1989. And I wonder, what is the actual goalpost? And are these dates a distraction?
Well, 2050 is probably the soonest that we could get emissions near to zero. And so that's where that date comes from. The more you force up the temperature, the more you get sea level rise and the more you get left. We don't know some magic number where, it's dramatically worse. It's bad the more it warms up. And for subsistence farmers, they're already seeing it. We see events in the US, including, weirdly, because they call it warming, the ability of cold fronts to come in and cause disaster. All of the extreme things get more likely. And, I think that's creating an awareness. But, I wish we could get it done before 2050. That's, there's just too much to replace. The next 10 years, we have to do a lot of invention because when you're talking about all sorts of steel and cement factories, scaling up deployment globally will take those next 20 years.
So let's talk about the inventions. You've been looking for solutions that have unbelievable scale and reliability, funding some of those through Gates Ventures over the last 13 years. Where should investors be placing their bets right now?
Well, this is going to change a lot of industries. The car industry, and you've got people like GM saying after 2035, they won't make gasoline cars. All these manufacturing businesses will have to change their processes. I put about $2 billion in to a variety of things, and I'm both directly and indirectly through Breakthrough Energy Ventures that I created, trying to make sure there's high risk capital for every area of emission. In fact, backing a number of companies in each area because the failure rate will be fairly high. But there's promising work. We talk about the green premium, which is the extra cost to buy, say, a ton of green cement versus the normal cement. Those green premiums are very, very high. And I propose in the book that the size of those metrics and bringing those down to be very, very small, that's actually the best indication. Will the world be able to achieve this very ambitious goal, even more than the near-term reductions, because you can make near-term reductions and not solve the hard parts. And we need all the parts.
Now, so much of the problem involves big things, as you point out, like steel and cement and fertilizer. And I wonder how much do individuals and individual decisions really matter? Like if I stop eating burgers, which you point out are a big carbon culprit, will that really make a difference?
Well, yes, your carbon footprint will go down dramatically if you don't eat meat. But one way to do that is to be a customer some portion of the time of these new ways of making ground beef that people like Beyond and Impossible and others are bringing out. Because as demand for those goes up, they scale up their factories, they improve the quality, they get the price to come down. So whether it's an electric car or artificial burger, that demand is catalytic because we're trying to recreate what we saw with solar panels and lithium-ion batteries, where the volume actually brought the cost down. And for the passenger car, within 10 to 15 years, all these improvements will mean the green premium, the extra what you give up with an electric car where you might need a tax credit, that'll go all the way to zero. And the market, as you saw with GM's plans, will be green without the government having to impose regulations or tax credits. But those things are so key to help us get to that end state.
Now, we know you love burgers, and I'm just curious, like, what do you do when you get a craving? How often can you just not resist and you just eat a good old-fashioned burger?
Well, about 50% of the time when I have a burger, it's one that's made with these Impossible Foods or Beyond Meat ground beef. And those have essentially no greenhouse gas emissions. As they improve their products, and they're quite good, I really highly recommend that people try those. I'll get to the point where I'm 100% buying just those burgers. I'm also spending money on direct air capture and lots of things to completely offset my carbon footprint, which, it's very high because of the way I travel and, I have more than one house. So, I'm in a sense one of the most guilty, but I'm pioneering offset approaches that are really honest, and that as those get purchased, they'll also come down in price.
So you're planning to give meat up 100%?
The cow-based meat, now, some people are trying to change the cow's diet or capture the methane. So, I don't want to count the cow out. There's a lot of ingenuity there, But right now, these protein-based approaches have surprised me how far they've come. And when they've been offered in burger chains, the demand has been quite good.
Now, some of the critics have said you don't focus on the political obstacles enough when it comes to climate change. You're solely focusing on the technology here. If there's one thing that the Biden administration could do to help solve this problem faster that would really make a difference, what would that one thing be?
Well, the long lead time item to drive innovation is R&D funded by the government. And in the health space, the US has done a brilliant job with the National Institute of Health that's driven breakthroughs and creates private companies that take that and offer products to the US and to the world. The energy R&D budget is way too small, well below the health level. So that's got to go up dramatically. Some of the tax credits to help the new product categories like green steel and cement or energy storage, we need to apply that tactic there. And then the government's a big purchaser, and they can buy more of these green products. And so we really need to get going and push the innovation and push the demand side for those innovations as well.
Now, we just saw a major shock to the electric grid in Texas, a lot of deaths. You mentioned that energy plants there should have been weatherized. And I'm curious, where do you think we should be making investments right now before this happens again?
Well, there's two things the Texas event shows and one thing it doesn't. It doesn't show that renewables were the problem in that case because there were shutdowns because of lack of weatherization in natural gas and even tripping one reactor to go off. But the two things it does show is that we're going to have more extreme events, so we need to be ready for that. And we need to invest in resilience. It is fair to say that if you don't build transmission and storage and some nuclear, which is not weather dependent, that you are going to have a lack of reliability when there's tough weather. And the politics of permitting transmission lines, we need to come up with a way to make that more attractive. So there's a legitimate issue of reliability, although it wasn't the problem in this case.
Now, your fellow tech titans like Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk, they're all tackling different elements of the climate crisis. And I'm wondering if you should all join forces like the Climate Avengers or something to really take this on.
Well, Elon, Tesla pioneered the electric car market, which is great. His carbon challenge for direct air capture will be good. Jeff Bezos has made a gigantic commitment with his climate fund. And actually, I am talking to him. We will end up doing some things in partnership, and at least we'll understand what the other one is up to. So I agree, as we get more people engaged, figuring out, okay, what is the path for innovation, both supplying and demanding innovation, we should brainstorm more, although, our individual ideas are part of the strength of, crazy entrepreneurs working on this problem.
How might we see you partnering with Jeff Bezos?
Well, he's funded a lot of the key climate organizations. We're talking about, and he's part of Breakthrough Energy Ventures. The idea of how you create a demand side for these green products, even in the early stage where their green premium will be high, that's an area where, we need something. I've realized of all the missing pieces, and we talk about that as being catalytic in nature. We want to bring companies and governments in on that, but having a strong base of philanthropic capital to get it started would be fantastic.
And yet, Jeff Bezos obviously has made that $10 billion commitment, but these Amazon cardboard boxes, the blue and white envelopes, I hear even worse, the trucks for delivery. I mean, shouldn't a company as innovative as Amazon be able to figure that out?
Well, you can't put every societal problem on Amazon. They are part of the physical economy delivering goods. So of course their scope 3 emissions are large. So there's Amazon as a company that's committed to electric delivery vehicles and funding innovation. And then there's Jeff as an individual, where that 10 billion is even more than I've spent. I've spent a few billion, and I'll spend a few billion more in the years ahead. So, in both cases, I think you'll see thoughtful ways of spending the money. But this requires, all of society to get engaged. It's not, just one intervention or one, company that can fix this.
The first part of my interview with Bill Gates there, part 2, coming up later, including his thoughts on the COVID-19 pandemic, vaccines, and even Bitcoin. Much more coming up on Bloomberg Technology. This is Bloomberg. Some tech-related stories we're following this hour. Media channel Discovery saying its Discovery Plus streaming service has passed 11 million direct-to-consumer customers worldwide. It debuted in January with more than 50 original programs and a library of over 55,000 episodes aired. Twitter is on a roll. A couple of months ago, it permanently banned President Trump from its service. That sent shares below where they opened when the company went public in 2013, but the stock is now up 33% this year. Last week, it set a share price record. Investors appear to like Twitter's product improvements and more aggressive content moderation. And coming up, Microsoft co-founder Bill Gates shares his take on Tesla, Bitcoin, and the 500,000 COVID deaths in the United States. All of that next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. In his new book, Bill Gates says technological innovation is the only solution to the impending climate disaster. But one could also argue that technology is standing in the way, given how social media perpetuates the misinformation that climate change is a hoax. In the second part of our interview, Gates addresses the responsibility of companies like Facebook and Twitter, as well as Tesla, Bitcoin, the pandemic, and more.
I know in the case of the pandemic, there's a lot of crazy conspiracy things out there, and that, is widespread and affecting mask use and openness to vaccination. In climate, yes, we're probably likely to get that, particularly as we succeed in getting governments to, have aggressive policies, understanding why some people don't see this problem or feel a need to deny the problem. I think we have to be, very thoughtful about who will they trust to be convinced, who could go out and look at these coral reefs or, look at the heat wave or, just look at the model. It shows that, the beaches in lots of places will be gone. This is because it's a multi-decade task. Being shrill may not be the way to get going. So lots of education, and that's part of the goal of the book, is to get people talking about, wow, if we were going to commit, there should be a real plan, not just, things that seem effective, like, divesting this stock or that stock, and which is a fine thing to do if people feel like that, but it's not. To actually reduce the emissions, you have to change the way you make steel. There's just no kind of metric or divestment or, blocking traffic that alone will get rid of those emissions.
So you've never just wanted to pick up the phone and call Mark Zuckerberg and say, hey, this is really slowing me down?
Well, Mark, he's he's got to maintain kind of an open platform, and on vaccine things, they've stepped up to try and get the egregious stuff out of there. I have a good dialogue with Mark. I think he's been put in a hard position in terms of what the government rules or what a company should do to let debate continue while you have the really extreme stuff that drives people into sort of a non-reality position. How do you distinguish those things, and who's supposed to do that? When you have millions of messages every hour.
At the same time, you recently said you think Trump should and eventually will be let back on Twitter. Why support that when he spreads so much misinformation about issues like climate and vaccines, which you care about?
Well, there's a question whether labeling things is better. I mean, those messages are likely to show up somewhere. It's a country with a First Amendment. And so, do you want to have one party have one social network and the other party have another social network? This, unlike climate, where I'm in talking to the best scientists and funding it, the way we draw the boundaries on social networking, I don't have that solution, but I know that we need very smart people at Facebook and universities trying to say, how do you draw the line there? I haven't seen a proposal where you go, wow, if you do that, then it's as open as it needs to be and the crazy stuff goes away. And I look at every idea. So, I think this is a societal challenge.
Now, while you're pouring money into vaccines, some of your peers are pouring money into rockets. And I'm curious, do you think Earth will ever be more uninhabitable than Mars? Like, is this really what's going to save the human race?
Well, I think we should preserve this planet and make it hospitable to human life. The idea of Mars or even artificial planets, it's great that other people are doing that, but I'm not involved in that. I don't see that as part of the solution. I don't think I'm missing something there. But you're talking about, when you're talking about Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, they're in the climate game and in a constructive way, which I'm at least glad that they're putting some of their resources in this direction.
So speaking of Elon, you've said we need hundreds of Elon Musks, and with Tesla's expansion in places like China and India, that's only going to increase their carbon footprint. Should Tesla be more upfront about that?
Well, Tesla reduces your carbon footprint. And if they get, an electric car, as we convert the electric generation to be zero emissions, is one of the few categories that we see a path to zero. Now, it's only about 7% of emissions come from passenger cars globally, and so you can't declare victory there. But as the cost of those cars comes down, the range goes up, the charge points are more numerous and standardized and quick charging, you'll feel like, yes, a gasoline car, less maintenance, quieter. The market will eventually take care of this. And so you won't need regulations, even though they've been used, including a tax credit, to get the volume up to get to that point. And so every category needs to go through that process of bringing its green premium down dramatically.
Now, I understand you own a Porsche electric car yourself. Elon has in the past claimed you shorted Tesla, and I wonder if there's any truth to that.
Well, I think Tesla's an amazing company. I wish I'd, been more on the long side, but it's great. And I have lots of relatives who own Teslas that I've helped buy for them. So, nothing but positive thoughts about Tesla and its role.
Now that said, I'm curious for your thoughts here, because Tesla could potentially make more money from its Bitcoin investment this year than profits from electric cars in all of 2020. What's your take on that? What's your Bitcoin take and the fact that the price can just go up or down based on a simple tweet from him?
Well, look, Elon has tons of money and he's very sophisticated. So, I don't worry that, his Bitcoin will sort of randomly go up or down. I do think people get bought into these manias who may not have as much money to spare. So I'm not bullish on Bitcoin. And, my general thought would be that, if you have less money than Elon, you should probably watch out.
Why aren't you bullish on Bitcoin?
Look, there are things we invest in society that produce output. Bitcoin happens to use a lot of energy. It happens to promote anonymous transactions. They're not reversible transactions. The Gates Foundation does a lot in terms of digital currency, but those are things where you can see who's making the transaction. So digital money is a good thing. And, there's a different approach that's local currency and attributed and, deals with all the money laundering and terrorism type regulations, and yet gives you the very the convenience and the low cost of transaction. And so, our foundation is very proud that in the pandemic, a lot of the countries we funded to do this were able to get money out to their citizens very, very efficiently. So that's something that it's not got the visibility of Bitcoin, but the move towards digital money that we're very engaged in is a super positive thing that eventually will get to even the poorest countries.
So let's talk about the pandemic. Obviously, your other big focus, in addition to climate change, the US just hit 500,000 deaths. And I just wanted to take a moment there. How does that number strike you?
Well, it's unbelievably. It's, more than any war we've been in, except the Civil War. It's enough that I'm sure it's touched almost everybody. We count on government to both before something bad happens and when something bad happens to protect us. And it didn't work in this case. So, hopefully it's a lesson going forward about investments in global health that the US and the US cooperating with other countries need to get done to be ready for the next pandemic.
How concerned are you about the new variants and vaccines keeping up?
Well, amazingly, our foundation was studying 3 vaccines in trials in South Africa when the variant showed up. And so we were able to gather really detailed data showing that they all still had some beneficial effect, but particularly Novavax and Johnson & Johnson, even though they worked a little less well, were still a great tool there. And so weirdly, the US didn't sequence enough to see its variants like the UK and even what we funded in South Africa. Now that's being remedied, just another miscue by the country that should have done the best job. So we'll get on top of the variants. We may need to tune the vaccines. All the manufacturers are looking through how quickly they could get that done. It'll add to the transmission and deaths, but if we get vaccination rates up, only by at most a month or 2.
Are Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson doing enough to prioritize populations in developing countries? And what's the ideal shot for the developing world?
No, the private sector, including those 3 companies, did a fantastic job. We've been backing the mRNA approach for about a decade now. Sadly, it's not that mature, and so you can't scale it up as much as we'd like, nor is it cheap. And so the vaccines 3 through 5, AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, and Novavax, can be scaled up through Indian factories to a higher degree. So for developing countries, those 3 and sending the right ones to the right place will be most of the solution, not to take away from anything that Pfizer, who funded its work, or Moderna did. But those will mostly land in rich countries.
So at this point, what are the biggest headwinds that you see in the vaccine manufacturing process?
Yeah, well, every day there's a complex discussion about, okay, do we have enough glass vials for fill finish? Do we have all these different ingredients that come from different countries. I do think some of the, vaccine nationalism where people are trying to look good in their own country by somewhat blocking things going around, that's, there's huge downside in that. We need to get the vaccines out in large numbers. We need to end this epidemic globally. And from the beginning, the voice of the foundation is included, not only moving faster, but this equity question. And over the next 4 or 5 months, the world can behave well. It's mostly governments now that are limiting how much we can help countries that don't have vaccine factories.
My conversation there with Bill Gates, co-founder of Microsoft, co-chair of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. You can catch the full interview at Bloomberg.com. Also remember, check out his new book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, the solutions we have and the breakthroughs we need. All right, coming up, a lab of the future where drug discovery can be done from a coffee shop. We'll speak to the president and CEO of Strateos, a startup pioneering remote-controlled robotic labs in the cloud. That is next. This is Bloomberg. In the age of remote work and social distancing, scientists can now conduct research experiments from anywhere using Strateos' fully automated robotic labs. The Silicon Valley startup aims to transform the traditional techniques that require researchers to physically work in the lab itself. Strateos saying its remote labs can help shorten the drug discovery process and allow scientists to collaborate virtually around the world. This is part of our work shifting segment today. Joining us to discuss, Strateos CEO Mark Fisher. Mark, thank you so much for joining us. So tell us a little bit about how the technology works.
We're pretty excited to have a complete platform that is a foundational sea change to the future of life science discovery. And in our view, life sciences needs to be pushed more towards an information science. In order to do that, you need the ability to generate lots of data and at low cost with extreme high fidelity. To accomplish that, Strateos has created a platform of over 25 automation modules representing over 200 instruments in 2 different locations, with the ability to run a couple 100,000 tests per day that encompass the full-scale capabilities of making compounds and making chemistry and rapidly testing those compounds across a variety of biological tests in order to accelerate discovery. When you combine that with the promise, go ahead.
What kind of demand has your technology seen in the midst of the pandemic and remote work demand?
Yeah, it's really escalated. That's a condition where our leads have increased 400%. We're expecting double sales year over year. And we've had a substantial increase in the kinds of transactions that people are interested in doing on the platform. And by way of example, Department of Energy is about to kick off a project with us through the CARES Act that ties together artificial intelligence, designed drugs for COVID on our test platform to drive the validity and approach for what we're doing, not just for today, but also for future discoveries and for future pandemics.
And what are the challenges of not having scientists directly in the lab, or the limitations?
You know, scientists really don't need to be there in the context that what they really want to have are the data. And in order to get the data, we have full ability to use robots and mechanization, which is common across all other industries, and replacing the 1850 artisan style of what's happening today mostly in labs. And allowing scientists the ability to have high reproducibility of data sets, because everything has to follow the computer code that's in behind that. And what that means in turn is that scientists can still observe the experiments online and track and watch it to assure nothing is going astray. But at the same time, they have high degree of confidence that they're getting clean data to be able to prosecute their investigations.
Interesting. All right, the CEO of Strateos, Mark Fisher, thank you so much for sharing your technology with us. All right, coming up, lawmakers preparing for the first major hearing into one of the biggest cyber incidents in U.S. history. We will bring you a conversation with Senator Mark Warner, chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, next. This is Bloomberg. Top executives from SolarWinds, Microsoft, and FireEye are set to testify Tuesday in the first major congressional hearing following a massive Russian breach of the federal government. Mark Warner, chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, spoke earlier with Bloomberg's chief Washington correspondent, Kevin Cirilli.
We obviously have seen well-known attacks over the last number of years. We saw the Sony hack. We saw the hack by the Chinese into our government files with Office of Personnel Management. We've seen recently what appears again to have been a Chinese hack into Equifax. But these were giant sucking information out of individualized enterprises. Again, closer to classic espionage, although for malicious purposes. The fact that this went fully into the supply chain, the fact that this could have been even passed on from any enterprise into additional enterprises, like a daisy chain effect, really raises this attack to a different level of seriousness. The fact that the adversary didn't use it to create these multiple trap doors, back to your analogy, we were lucky, but they got in without us seeing them. And they had the possibility of doing that. And one of the things that we've also found that's been in the public press already is that the adversary was able to generate this attack from domestic servers. In the past, we have some of the best assets, cyber assets in the world, in the NSA and at Cyber Command. But again, our rules don't let those enterprises, for the most part, touch domestic assets. If the bad guys can figure out, well, gosh, we can't bring our A-team if we can launch this attack from a domestic server, and then there's no mandatory requirement for those private companies, or for that matter, even the public enterprises, the public agencies, to actually report that attack to any responsible party, we are extraordinarily vulnerable. And in this particular case, but for the forward-leaning actions of the private company FireEye doing the right thing, we could potentially be still in the dark. Thank goodness they leaned forward. You know, they came forward, and starting in December, we've started to try to remedy this, but we're still, 3 months in. While we've got a pretty good handle on how extensive this was, we don't have it all 100% buttoned down.
Here we are in Washington debating a $1.9 trillion stimulus, talks of even starting to negotiate infrastructure. There's some chatter national security, digital infrastructure should be included in that. You mentioned at the start of this interview that everyone expects for countries to participate and partake in some type of espionage for their own national security interests. We are the most developed country technologically on the planet. And yet I'm struck by an analogy that I grew up with. People who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. Does our capability, does our strength in cyber, in digital infrastructure, in this situation, make us more vulnerable?
Kevin, it does. The fact that we are more reliant on information technology than many of our adversaries does make us more vulnerable. And in many ways, it's one of the reasons why we have been reluctant to punch back and frankly gave Russia and China and other first-tier adversaries kind of a running field where they could attack us with almost impunity. We've seen that. We've done very little to respond to OPM. We've done very little to respond to Equifax. We still don't have high enough responsibility standards for our private sector companies. So this is how the living in a glass house analogy makes some sense, but this is not going away. And this asymmetric type battle is one of the reasons why we need to create, I think, not only for ourselves, but with our partners, our allies, something the last administration was loath to do. We need to create these level of international standards that say, if the bad guys, for example, if the bad guys come in and attack this broadly into supply chains, because other countries other than America were affected by SolarWinds, there needs to be potentially a stronger response, not just from us, but from the international community at large.
Senator Mark Warner there with our own Kevin Cirilli. Of course, we will be following that hearing Tuesday throughout the day. And that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. Bloomberg Daybreak Asia coming up next. This is Bloomberg.